This is the Mamoritai Euphony Headphone Amp, and it was made by, wait for it, Euphony Audio. Yes, that company that makes cheap and cheerful audio gear on Amazon, which is, yeah, really cheap and cheerful, made a $2,000 headphone amp. And, well, you can see it's so shiny, you can actually see my reflection in the monitor for my camera. And this, I mean, they contacted me as Mamoritai Audio and said, we have a Kickstarter for this amp. And I said, oh, well, I don't really do Kickstarters because, for obvious reasons, after some of them have gone disastrously wrong, LH Labs. And then I said, well, you've got to tell me who you are. And they said, oh, we're Euphony Audio. And I said, really? But so they're an established manufacturer of, well, cheap audio gear. Although looking online, they seem to have upgraded the style of their audio gear and upped the price a little bit. So they do look a little bit more classy than they did before. But this was a really unexpected thing from them. And as you can see, they've certainly gone all out, at least on the chassis. And at a $2,000 odd price, yeah, they're heading into a pretty competitive market. So it remained to be seen whether this amp would actually be competitive when I got it. Now, in terms of features, it could say for $2,000, it's doesn't have as many features as you might expect. Basically, all you get on the front is, as well as the fancy logo, which strangely enough came with a second one in silver, for those who think gold is too blingy. It's basically a single-ended amp with even a volume control that doesn't have any indicator on it and is just very shiny. And probably the ultimate fingerprint magnet of any amp I've seen. It does have a preamplifier output, but it's not switchable. So it basically is always on, and it's only got a voltage switch on the back, and that's about it. It does have one more thing though. It does have gain, a gain switch, but not outside, it's actually inside. And another thing that's inside is you can change part of the amplification. Now, originally this came with, well, two op amps. Op amps are little chips, basically, which have an entire amplifier in the circuit, and they're used in everything. I mean, they're so common that basic phone DACs even have them built in. It's the basic amplification circuit crammed into the smallest possible space using on-chip components, and can provide some degree of amplification, and usually sometimes enough for headphones to some degree. And they're often used like the gain stages of more powerful amplifiers, as they are in this. And the ones they use, as you may have seen advertised, the Muses O2 op amp, which is available for the preamp output, but the headphone output one is socketed so that you had the option, if you bought on Kickstarter, of getting the upgrade Spark OS op amp. Now, to have a look at what an op amp is, and I'll show you inside this in a minute, this, if you can just see next to my finger, is a Muses O2 op amp. I'm trying to get to the point where the camera will focus on it, which is there. And on the left for you is a Spark OS op amp. And you can see basically it uses a bunch of discrete components on a circuit board, or actually two circuit boards because there are two channels, and that you can plug in alternatively to one of these op amps if they're socketed, or solder in if you're that good. Now, if you want to get an idea of what is inside an op amp, way back and even now to some degree, you can get op amps which are made of full-size discrete components, like the full-size ones that you solder through holes into circuit boards, and it ends up looking like this. So you can see, if the camera's going to focus, look at an op amp, Spark OS op amp versus a full-size, and this is an old Audio GD op amp. You can see there's a lot there. Now, apparently, inside regular chip op amps, it's very hard to get things like capacitors. And so the benefit of having a device such as this is you can actually put capacitors on there, and capacitors are really important for power, which is something I'm going to talk about in just a bit. Now, you can open this up, and to do so you remove 6 screws on the bottom, and then, well, getting the top shell off is a little bit of a challenge, so I got out one of these good old suction cups which I use for opening up my phones for replacing the batteries. So with that, and just so you know, I haven't taken the plastic film off the top here because I just decided not to. So if you're wondering, there actually aren't any scratches on here, it's just scratches on the film. With a good plod in the middle, you can actually yank the top off and you're going to hear it. It's certainly substantial metal. I mean, they certainly went all out with the chassis on this one. But inside, you have what has to be the cleanest and one of the nicest looking amps I've ever encountered. Now, hopefully the lighting, yes, is going to work out pretty well there. And you can probably already see this Spark OS op amp. Let's get my left and my right correct because I'm looking at a monitor. You can see it sitting there, whereas the original Muses O2 op amp for the preamp section is visible below. And you can see everything is so neatly laid out, and there's a cover over here to make sure you don't electrocute yourself when you are changing things, and you're supposed to completely unplug the amplifier when you're changing anything around. But even if you do go for one of the old big huge op amps, there's plenty of room in the chassis to do so if you do decide to switch it to something larger, like one of the Burson ones, for example. So now I gather that by default for your $2,000, you are going to get this op amp, and it certainly made a significant difference as changing the amplification circuit of an amplifier will do. I mean, it's not at all an insignificant upgrade, as I have shown. You're literally changing the entire circuit, or a large proportion of it. Though there are, as you see, a massive amount of capacitance with these giant capacitors here, and capacitors for each of the main output transistors along here. And that means there is plenty of, well, power on tap for the power that it has. Now, it doesn't have a huge amount of power. I mean, we're used to seeing watts when we're talking about headphone amplifiers. Even though we don't actually use all of that, it ends up providing us with headroom. Now, the thing is, they advertise this as having 1200 milliwatts, but I think that was a peak measurement. Realistically, it's about 800 milliwatts, which doesn't seem a lot, all things considered, but actually, with plenty of capacitance and a good circuit, is more than enough to drive even somewhat demanding headphones like these Susvara Unveiled or the Dan Clark Audio models I have sitting behind me, as well as others. So I never found that power was a problem, and I don't listen super loud, which is something to note. Listening super loud is actually bad for your hearing. Your ears will actually shut down if you really try and turn the volume up, and so you're actually working against yourself. It's better to listen at quieter volumes, and it's more likely to be in the optimum output level for the amplifier to begin with. Now, interesting thing, which I will mention, is someone asked on one of my videos, why would the bass distort first in amplifiers? They put it forward some numbers and thought that doesn't make any sense. Well, actually it does. A low frequency signal is wider and a high frequency signal is narrower. And so that wider low frequency signal requires more energy. The space under the sine wave overall is the amount of power that has to be pushed through. So a bass transient requires more energy from the amplifier than a high frequency treble transient. And that means that's why you could even get something like a Shit Audio Magni, which has maybe 3 watts on tap, I think it was. And even though you have that, you'll notice with a pair of planers, such as the ones I have behind me, when you turn the volume up, the bass will start to distort first. You'll start to hear it kind of losing control because it doesn't have as much in the way of power reserve available as do other amps. So even though this only has 800 milliwatts available, it seems to be sufficient for the listening I've done to perform really well. Now, you obviously want to know how well it performed. I used it with Chord's TT2 and M scaler I have here. Interestingly, Mamoritai, I saw pictures of them at various shows demonstrating it with the Chord TT2. Now, being single-ended only is not such a disadvantage in terms of connectivity. We're used to having balanced DACs and using the balanced outputs, though in my experience the single-ended outputs of the majority of DACs are quite sufficient. With the Chord TT2 obviously and other Chord DACs, the single-ended output is the better output, so it was an ideal match, although of course the TT2 already has a sufficient headphone amplifier. But I wanted to see how well it could perform overall. Now in that, the level of detail and resolution coming through was fantastic. So I really felt this is able to bring through the best that the TT2 had to offer. It's probably more a realistic match with something like a Chord Q-Test, simply because you probably want to pick it with a DAC that does not have a built-in headphone amplifier, or maybe a headphone amplifier that is maybe not quite as strong, maybe something like the Hi-Fi Man Serenade if you really like warm-sounding R2R DACs. But I certainly didn't feel wanting in the resolution department. On the other hand, in terms of soundstage, and people asked me to talk about soundstage more, because the crosstalk on this, that is the crosstalk between the left and right channels, is a little bit high versus other amplifiers, especially balanced amplifiers such as the ones I have behind me, such as the Shit Audio Mjolnir, or even just the single-ended Studio 6. That means that the soundstage seems a little bit narrower, not a huge amount, but narrower and more intimate, and it does give more of a sense of kind of punchiness to the sound versus some of the other amps I have here, especially the bigger ones. And that meant that while you could call it a negative, I mean, I noticed it more in comparison, it meant the amp overall was a little bit more I'd probably say, deliberate sounding and intimate and punchy than the big iron amps I have, which are kind of more relaxed, open, and effortless in their power and dynamic delivery. But it was a very, very dynamic sounding amp. That is, the dynamics of the music were delivered very, very well through this. So it was kind of exciting to listen to, but also refined at the same time. Now, originally they sent it with the Muses O2 op amp in the circuit for the headphone amplifier, and it kind of sounded, a little bit, well, it sounded fine, but nothing particularly special. With the SparkOS op amp upgrade, that made a significant difference, and now it started to really sound like a $2,000 amplifier. I mean, looking at the numbers, for example, the Muses O2 op amp seemed to have higher harmonics, so it gave it a bit of a maybe softer sound, which you kind of can get from that, whereas the SparkOS, from measurements I've seen, has less in the way of harmonics and was overall more clear, and that was certainly very audible with a, I don't want to say brighter, but kind of more clear, more dynamic, more detailed sound as a result, and that really made it sound like a $2,000 headphone amplifier. Now, to give some music examples, one of my favorite artists lately is Jono McCleery. Now, I heard him some time ago back on the old Bowers and Wilkins Society of Sound albums, which unfortunately are no longer available, but he just released a new album, which you should definitely check out. As a very original artist with some very passionate songs he writes. Now, his latest album is called Reconcile, and even his older album, Moonlit Parade, which is also excellent, which he released a few years ago, there is a really excellent amount of both micro and macro dynamics. And that was a really key thing. You could hear the subtle details of what was going on in the recording, but as well the punchiness of each of instruments and the music overall were both at the same time fantastic. Especially the percussion on the Pictures track on Moonlit Parade. The percussion had a really lovely snap to it, and the bass notes reverberated with really great detail when using the TT2 and M scaler as the source. So for the subtleties of the guitar plucks, the last sounds of even Jono's breath as he's breathing as he's singing, they're really readily apparent listening with the Euphony and say the Susvara Unveiled or one of the top-end Dan Clark audio headphones. One of my other favorite artists is José Gonzalez, and in one of his tracks, Slow Moves, off the Veneer album. Now, the Studio 6, of course, is very effortless in how it presents music. You don't feel like the amplification is really amplifying. Of course, there are some harmonics and some warmth from the tubes, depending on what selection you put in there. In comparison, the Euphony, it gave me the ability to get an idea of how the Euphony was in the way it presents music, which is, I probably describe as being a little bit more deliberate. Maybe a touch of, say, thickness from that crosstalk, which flattens things maybe just a tad. And it's something you only really notice in comparison, whereas the amp on its own just sounds great. And, funnily enough, probably due to the way the tubes are in the Studio 6, sometimes it can actually sound brighter than the Euphony, although I wouldn't call this amp at all sounding, warm or dull in any way, unless you include the fact, just the higher crosstalk, which brings, all the everything together more. So one of the things I thought to try, of course, I often listen with planers, but what about the good old HD800S, which I have behind me here? It's got a non-audio draw cable on it, in case you're wondering what that cable is. People always ask. And through that, I was listening to actually the Black Keys, which is another of my favorite artists. Now, the Weight of Love, which is one of my favorite tracks, through the HD800S, well, the narrower stage was quite audible, as it tends to be with headphones that sound quite wide. And with modern music, I feel that these headphones need more bass to be impactful, and I tend to, go through with a Lockius when I need to do that. Actually works very, very well with HD800S. I'll talk about that when I get around to doing the Lockius review. So while it was kind of warmer and more intimate, I felt, if I want to have something different for the HD800S, I probably would have go for just, getting a Lockius and jacking up the bass for those times when I need to do that. Interestingly, though, it was kind of a reverse situation where the HD800S, it was a kind of thicker sound through the Studio 6 with all its tubes than the Euphony, where it sounded kind of, less thick sounding. So the reverse compared to the planers, which was, quite an unexpected result, as the Studio 6 has its own kind of character, which is, it depends on what you plug in and even what day of the week it is and how warm it is. So that's something to consider as well. Now, I mentioned that it does have gain settings in here, and you can flip 4 little dip switches inside to give you low gain if you so desire, which is a bit of a pain in the butt if you, are switching backwards and forwards a lot. Now, I got out the good old a good old post-it note and actually stuck it to the volume control for when I wanted to get an idea of where things were, how high up on the volume control I was for different headphones. I generally went from about 9 p.m. to 12 p.m. on high gain with the Susvara Unveiled, which will be similar for the Dan Clark Audio Stealth and Expanse. But that kind of gain was too high for something, really sensitive, like the 105 AERs, which I have in for review. They have something, I think it was like 113 decibels per milliwatt. They're like IEM level sensitive, which is fantastic if you want to plug them into something like I have a MacBook Pro, which has very, very low gain, and that works out really well. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll switch to the low gain and see how they go. And that actually worked out very well, because then I could get 9 o'clock on the volume dial. One of the advantages of having a very good volume pot is that you don't get that channel imbalance at the initial movement. So you actually have a little bit more volume range than you might do with some, a generic Alps pot that hasn't been, say, custom ordered for Alps to have, better tracking. So in that, with a low gain, I could even plug in in-ear monitors, and I plugged in the good old Final A8000s, for example, and I could get up to 9 p.m. and for moderate level listening with a lot of music, and I could even get a usable listen out of the old and super sensitive Campfire audio models like the Solaris and Andromeda from the amp in low gain. And just as an experiment with the music off, turning the volume up to maximum, I heard less hiss in high gain than low gain actually with headphones, but it meant that I had plenty of usable volume range without any hiss getting in for normal listening, even with super sensitive in-ear monitors and headphones. So it certainly covered everything from the less sensitive stuff to the very sensitive stuff, suggesting a very competent amplification design. Lastly, as a preamp, it performed very adequately as a preamp. I put it into my Master 10 as a volume control, and it worked perfectly fine, sounding pretty much the same as I've described. Overall, I really like this amp from Mamoritai Audio, or Fossey Audio as they're known for most of their gear. I think it's pretty excellent overall. Probably the main thing is they included a funky power cable with the amp, but no gain switch on the front. It was kind of like, I think they may have, in terms of features, slightly misjudged what was most ideal for the design, although maybe having the gain switches internally rather than on the front meant fewer traces from the amplification circuit to, say, the front panel or whatever, and may have been done that way specifically to improve sound quality. And it certainly has worked. Their design, it sounds absolutely fantastic, with the only negative, of course, being that slightly higher crosstalk means that the soundstage isn't quite as wide as you might get on some other amplifiers. And of course, if you specifically want a balanced amplifier, well, this is not it. But I don't think that's really a detriment if you have, say, a regular DAC of some kind where the main output is the balanced output. As long as it has RCA outputs, even things such as, say, the Shit Audio Bifrost or the Topping Centaurus, which I have in for review, will be more than sufficient to work with something like this amplifier. So as always, I invite people who own the products I review to post their own comments and their own feedback with their own experiences with the product. And certainly anyone who has bought one of these, I certainly invite them to comment on their own experiences with it. And that will also make my review more useful, as you can get not just my impressions of the product, but impressions from people who actually own it. Likewise, if you want help with your audio system and you want to interact with a really wonderful bunch of people in private, it's not a public Discord, I have a private chat which you can access by helping me out with my channel through sponsorship. For even just a couple of bucks a month through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, you can support my channel, and in turn I'll help you out with your audio system. And also you can see the impressions of gear that I have in for review long before I review it. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to chatting with you online.